All right. And we are live. Please, everyone in the comments section, let me know if you can hear and see us okay. And welcome to this live stream to those of you who are watching live, and welcome to those of you who are catching the replay as well. I'm here with Dr. Shady Nasser. I have no doubt that our esteemed guest will draw viewers from all different backgrounds. So I encourage all of you to sit back and relax and enjoy what will no doubt be an absolutely fascinating interview. I do hear a little bit of echo, Dr. Nasser. I think that's from YouTube. That might be, yeah.
Do you want me to use headphones?
Yes, I do hear a little bit of a lag. I think it might just be like if you're streaming YouTube, it might be there. Hear a little bit of echo.
So, sorry, I was opening the other. Okay, sorry.
Okay, that's great. Yeah. Oh, no problem, no problem. Yeah. So Dr. Nasser did his dissertation at Harvard University in 2011, where he earned a PhD in Arabic literature and Islamic studies. He's the author, of course, of several journal articles that have appeared in peer-reviewed journals like the Journal of Arabic Literature and Journal of Quranic Studies. He's also the author of the 2012 monograph, which shares the title with his dissertation, and that is The Transmission of the Variant Readings of the Quran, the Problem of Tawatur, and the Emergence of Shu'ath. He's also the author of the upcoming monograph, currently scheduled to be released on the 22nd of October, and that's called The Second Canonization of the Quran. And the subtitle is Ibn Mujahid and the Founding of the Seven Readings. He's also the Associate Professor of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at Harvard University. And in all of his spare time, he's also doing some fascinating work with early Islamic poetry and how that influences our understanding of the Quran. Dr. Nasser, it's a pleasure to have you. Welcome.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you for writing to me and inviting me to your show. I'm glad to be here to answer any questions, talk about variant readings, Quran. It's a pleasure. So my name, as you said correctly, Shady, and a variant reading is Shady, as my friends call me here. So both are standard, I would say. Yeah.
I like your sense of humor. Excellent. So we have a big, complex topic today, but you thankfully have a system for organizing this. You've observed roughly 5 stages or 5 canonizations throughout this process. So can you just start us off with a big picture view of what this process is and summarize it for us so that we can know what we're talking about?
Okay, so I'm calling these different stages of canonization of the Quran, where we notice that at different times in history, we do have certain readings in the Quran that they were excluded from, what we call now the canon. Okay, we call basically the first stage canonization or codification is what everyone is familiar with, the Uthmanic Codex. And this is the first canonization process where the readings or the codices of the companions of Muhammad, they were excluded based on the Codex of Uthman. So that's, what we call the first, or what I'm calling the first canonization. And then from the period of Uthman, let's say 200 years afterwards, we have a robust activity by the grammarians and exegetes to concentrate on this Uthmanic Codex. So even though Uthman's attempt to limit the variants of the Quran to one codex, variant readings kept multiplying. And this is evident from the early works of grammar and exegesis that we have, that you have uncontrollable amount of variants that Muslims were using and circulating among themselves. So the second canonization, which is the study that I did in the past 4 or 5 years, is what Ibn Mujahid did out of a corpus of, I don't want to say unlimited, but many readings that existed back then, probably as many as 50, as sources tell us. He chose 7 readings, and if we have time we can talk about the criteria later on, but he chose out of those different eponymous or system readings 7. So many scholars during the time of Ibn Mujahid and after him, they were not happy with the choice of the 7. So why did you choose only 7 out of so many? These readings are also good. This reading is as good as the one you chose. And people or scholars, they kept writing manuals of what we call qira'at or variant readings on more than 7 or even less than 7, 5, 6, 8, 9, etc. And also in Ibn Mujahid's system, when he chose the 7 readings, each reading was not unique. So you can see also there are differences within one reading. So when we talk about, let's say, Asim or Nafi' or these eponymous readers, Ibn Mujahid did not document only one variation. So there were many students of these eponymous readers, and there were also variations. So what happened is that you would have, let's say, a reading of Nafi' or Asim, and then you would have different students who were transmitting different things. And let's say around 150 years later on, in North Africa and Muslim Spain back then, so we have Abu Amr al-Dani and al-Shatibi, both of them, they were scholars of Qira'at, and they were mainly responsible for limiting those different variations or different students and limiting them into 2 only. So this is what we call the 2-Rawi canon, where each eponymous reader started to have only 2 readers, 2 transmitters per reader. So this is a 3rd canonization process where people from that stage onward, they started to become more familiar with only 2 variations or 2 varieties per one eponymous reading. So between, let's say, sorry, I work with the Islamic calendar, so my OSX, I need to convert, so 4th, 5th century, so that's about around, the 11th century. So this process of 3rd canonization, and then 300-400 years later, Ibn al-Jazari in the 9th century, Hijri, Islamic calendar, so that would be around the 1400s. He came and added 3 more readings to those 7 by Ibn Mujahid. And again, the same, over, for hundreds of years, people were not happy by just having 7. They were also reading and transmitting other system readings. And then Ibn al-Jazari came and then added those 3 readings, which already existed. So for hundreds of years, people were using those readings, but he did it, forcefully in a sense. And he was, let's say, the one of the most accomplished scholars of Qira'at during that day. So that's the 4th period where really the system of 10 readings or 10 canonical readings, what we call them, was fixed by the time of Ibn al-Jazari. And then what I call the 5th canonization, it's the 1923-1924 Cairo edition of the Quran based on Hafs and Asim. And I call it a canonization because, from that time onward, most Muslims became familiar with that variety, mainly due to the publication, of that codex or that, Mus'haf in Cairo. Even though we have, of course, other editions from other readers, but most people are familiar still, even until today, familiar with that variety. So this is a general overview of those 5 stages. And there are, of course, intermediary stages between these, but I consider them to be really important junctures where things were excluded and things were considered to be irregular, by the Muslim community, in favor of what we are calling now, canonical, or in Arabic, mutawatira, or massively transmitted readings. So that's a general overview of the 5 stages.
Excellent. So your first monograph, your 2012 monograph, The Transmission of the Variant Readings of the Quran, the Problem of Tawatur and the Emergence of Shu'ab. Can you explain to us, is it fair to say that you deal primarily with the 2nd and 3rd stage in detail in that monograph? Or is that a fair assessment?
Correct. So mainly in the first monograph, I dealt with it's not just specifically the 2nd and the 3rd stage, but the whole concept of qira'at or variant readings and the whole concept of tawatur, which is, for those who do not know, it's a concept that means there's something which is widely transmitted by people to the extent that it is impossible for this group of people to lie or to fabricate something about its transmission. So it's a self-evident truth. That's what we call tawatur. And the problem that that I try to tackle is how do we understand this concept of tawatur vis-a-vis qira'at or variant readings when many accounts from the classical sources do not agree with this concept of tawatur, this massively transmitted, and it's a self-evident transmission of variant readings. Variant readings, qira'at and Quran, are two different things. So when we talk about the Quran, we're talking about the concept of Quran. Forget about the variant readings. Variant readings is how to access this Quran or how to read it. In the early period, Muslims did not talk about this concept of tawatur, massive transmission, and it's very evident that the variant readings were local. So people in Damascus were transmitting things different, from people of Kufa or people from Mecca and Medina, and the reading or the variant reading was a local thing rather than a widely transmitted system that every single Muslim or even every single scholar knew of. So yes, I was focusing on this second, let's say the second stage or before the second stage, and afterwards a little bit to try to understand the mechanism by which Ibn Mujahid chose his system, and how did Muslim scholars react to his system, and when this system crystallized, and when did Muslims start to basically adopt it as part of their recitation. So yeah,
very interesting. And the variant readings are extremely important. I mean, you've said that this is how you access the Quran. Is that correct?
Correct. If you don't have variant reading, you can't read the Quran. It's as simple as this. So you don't have the system of variant readings are Masoretic text. For those who know Hebrew, it's just you need the vowels and you need diacritics in order to read it. There's you can't read the Quran using your own opinion, and that's in the Islamic tradition you have to rely on how your master taught it and how his master taught it. So you can't just do textual criticism. You can, of course, but you may not within the tradition. So there's a difference between someone who is who has a manuscript and say, okay, I'm going to do textual criticism, I'm going to read the Quran on my own, and some scholars did that back in the days. But of course, they were reprimanded. So if you don't have variant readings, the whole system with its principles and individual variations, you can't read the Quran. So this is why they are, intertwined and very, very important. These two together.
Yeah, and we know primarily of the variant readings in modern printed Qurans, but at some point these were transmitted strictly orally, correct? So when were these readings, when did they begin to be documented?
So this is a little bit problematic from the sense of documentation. We don't have enough documentation from the early period, and we don't know how much writing and orality were intertwined back then. And I'm talking here 8th century, okay? So according to the tradition, yes, the Quran was orally transmitted. It was memorized by people. However, there was a time when the Quran was codified during the time of Uthman, when orality lost to written transmission. And what I mean by that is that Muslim scholars all agreed that regardless of your memory, regardless of how you memorize the Quran, you cannot deviate from the Uthmanic Codex. So even though certain readers, they were sure of how they memorized the Quran through other channels, and they were saying that I have a good chain of transmission. I studied with X and Y and Z people. Muslim scholars post-Uthmanic period, they didn't care. As long as you are deviating from the text, we are not going to accept your reading, right? So in a sense, orality was attached to written transmission. So when someone tells you, well, the Quran was orally transmitted regardless of the rasm, regardless of the Uthmanic consonantal text. That's not accurate, because as long as you are deviating from the text, your reading will not be accepted. So there is a kind of reciprocal relationship between the written and the oral. There's no such thing as post-Uthmanic codification. There's no such thing as only oral transmission. You have to oral transmission based on the text. If you deviate from the text, regardless, no matter how good of a reader you are, no matter how fantastic your memory is, even if you deviate, by one letter from the consonantal text, one of the consonantal texts, the 5 or 6 they had back then, your transmission will not be accepted.
This, I think, touches on a question I have about shawadh, which, if you want to nuance the definition for the viewers, then fine. But for now, just non-canonical readings. There are some shawadh readings that are transmitted from the time of Muhammad and the companions, aren't there? So this is a question I had when I was reading your book. Ibn Mujahid and al-Tabari, it seems like they would have established their criteria so that they could have selected or canonized some of those readings, but their focus was more on razm and popularity, consensus. And is there a way they could have structured their criteria to canonize some of those readings that went back to Muhammad and the companions?
Yes, it's a very interesting question, in a sense that, the status of shawadh, there are different categories of shawadh, or irregular or anomalous readings. Okay, so the problem, let's talk about the easy category. The easy category is that you also have shawadh, or irregular readings, transmitted on behalf of the canonical readers. Imagine, for example, I have a chapter in my coming book. It's called the non-canonical readings of the canonical readers, right? So there are even transmissions on behalf of the canonical readers, which were also classified as shawadh, as irregular, not accepted. So this easy category is that these irregular readings, even though they agree with the Uthmanic Codex, they don't have they don't enjoy the consensus, let's say, of the readers, and they don't have a sound chain of transmission. Let's put it simply. It's more complicated than that, but just let's say they were not agreed upon by the community of the Qurra, or the readers. Now, the other complicated category of shawadh is those which deviated from the codification of Uthman, the Mus'haf. There are also readings attributed to the Prophet himself. We have a category in Qira'at. It's called the readings of the Prophet. Okay, and there are 3 or 4 books even written on that in Arabic. Even though we do have accounts that go back to the Prophet saying that he read this word as such, this word was also categorized as irregular or shawadh. Just like they didn't care. As long as the readings deviate from the Uthmanic Codex, we will consider them to be irregular or shawadh, even though we know that the Prophet might have read as such, and we also know that the other companions might have read as such. However, the Codex of Uthman abrogated all other codices, abrogated all other readings, and we are going to stick with that. So,
yeah, and that is what I had from the modern perspective. I'm thinking, why wouldn't Ibn Mujahid structure his criteria to accommodate those readings? But this is a modern perspective, so obviously I'm missing something. But it's a very interesting.
Yeah, because the thing is, Ibn Mujahid, he came around 300 years after Uthman, right? So we are talking about 3 centuries of Muslims only sticking to the Uthmanic Codex. But actually, that was not the case. We also have information from Iraq, from Kufa, that people kept reading according to the codices, let's say, of Ibn Mas'ud, even 150 years after Uthman. So yes, there were pockets in certain areas in the Islamic world, especially in Iraq. There were different, many things happening in Iraq back then. So it's uncontrollable in a sense. But we do have accounts that people were still reading according to the Codex of Ibn Mas'ud, which is different from the Codex of Uthman. So Ibn Mujahid, as someone appointed by, the state, as the, chief reader, of Baghdad back then, you have to agree, you have to confine yourself to the rest. And that's something that Muslims, for at least 2 centuries agreed that we are going to stick to the Uthmanic Rasm, and we can't accept anything that deviated or that deviate from the Uthmanic Codex.
Okay. Yeah. Ibn Mas'ud's reading is interesting. I get the impression that people love it or hate it. There's seems like some friction there with Uthman. Baqillani argued for Ibn Mas'ud's reading, right? There are some harsh words put on the lips of al-Hajjaj about Ibn Mas'ud's reading, but they're using it in Kufa until the 8th century. And so it seems like people loved it or hated it.
I mean, Ibn Mas'ud is very interesting because we as also many people pointed out, we have so many accounts about his rejection and his opposition, right, to the committee that Uthman formed. And he was saying, I'm one of those senior companions of the Prophet. He was criticizing Zayd bin Thabit, the head of the committee. You were a little kid playing with the other kids, and your forelock was dangling, from your head, while I was taking the Quran fresh from the mouth of the Prophet. And so, we always have to remember system readings or eponymous readings are very, very attached to geography, even until today. Even until today, if you talk to people, in Morocco, they are very proud of their Warsh reading. So they are very, very, conservative about the Warsh. You have people in Africa, they're very conservative about Abu Amr ibn al-Ala. People are attached locally to their reading. And this was the case also back then. People in Kufa, they were, groupies in a sense. It was the group of Ibn Mas'ud. And they did not want to abandon the reading of Ibn Mas'ud for political reasons. There's a lot of politics happening back then. And we do have, actually, there is an interesting account transmitted in the history of Ibn Khaldun, not his Muqaddimah, it's the history, which you don't find in other accounts. There's, some kind of tension between Zayd bin Thabit and Ibn Mas'ud. And actually, Ibn al-Arabi, not Ibn Khaldun, the jurist. He said that people claimed that Uthman and sent someone to beat Ibn Mas'ud. It even reached the stage of beating him and breaking some of his rib bones because of his opposition to to the Codex of Uthman. That's a weak account, but these things are transmitted. So it's exactly as you said. People were for Ibn Mas'ud, for his Mus'haf, and there were other people who completely opposed it. He deviated from the consensus of the Jama'ah or the group, and this is why they hated it. Despite that, it's still the reading of Ibn Mas'ud continued for at least 150 years in Kufa, and even in Hanafi fiqh, you would have many instances where the Hanafi jurists would actually use citations from the Codex of Ibn Mas'ud to support a legal argument. This is even up to the Ottoman period. So it is an interesting case, Ibn Mas'ud, and I think it deserves more careful study. Unfortunately, we don't have manuscripts from that period, but it is very interesting.
Yeah. Let's turn to Tawatur now. You mentioned sort of a paradox, and I think if you walk us through this paradox, it will help us understand a little bit more of a nuanced view about the importance of Tawatur and how it developed. You describe the Mutawatira consonantal skeleton of the Quran, and then accessing that through arguably non-Tawatur readings. Can you explain what that means? I think that'll help us understand this concept of Tawatur.
Right. So that's one of the questions, big questions that I ask in my first book. This paradox is that the Quran is transmitted via tawatur. This kind of self-evident truth. Okay, it's known for every single Muslim. It's known for everyone. It's down to the detail. It is as self-evident as the sun rises in the east and sunsets, and sets in the west, right? So that's that's what tawatur means. However, and that's the Quran, okay? So that's between the two covers. Now the paradox is reading it. It's the pronunciation or performing this text. Because we do have different systems of readings, we have different ways of reading it. How did these eponymous readings or system readings, how were they transmitted? Were they also transmitted via tawatur? And the answer is also problematic, because it seems that in the early period they were not thinking, this concept of tawatur was not applicable to qira'at. Okay, it was basically a local thing. This is the reading of the community, let's say, of Kufa or the community of Medina. Later on, what we call the usulis, the scholars of usul al-fiqh, principles of jurisprudence, they came up with this principle of tawatur. And then they would say that the Quran is mutawatir, and also the its readings are mutawatir. However, other scholars also, they oppose this notion, because the criteria of tawatur doesn't apply to these. When you have a reading which has a single chain of transmission, transmitted only by few people, even if it's transmitted by 3 or 4 or 5 transmissions, this does not provide tawatur. And this is why, let's say in I don't say early period, but let's say 5th century, 6th century, that would be 11th century, 12th century, there were scholars who were calling for this criteria of tawatur, because you do want the Quran to be mutawatir. If the Quran is not mutawatir, that's a big problem. It is the main source, it is the principal book of Islam. And if you say, well, it doesn't provide or it doesn't impart necessary knowledge, then it is a problem. So you have to establish the authenticity of the text. And if the variant readings, the way you access this text, are not mutawatira, then you do have a theological problem. And that's the paradox here. And this is why scholars were back and forth. Even by the time of Ibn al-Jazari, he died 833, so that would be 15th century. And as I mentioned in my book, in the early period, in his early life, he was fighting for this concept of tawatur. He said, well, all the qira'at are mutawatira. But then, later on, he did change his mind, and he didn't stipulate tawatur for that. He said, as long as we have a sound chain of transmission, that's enough. Because also in Islamic, theology or Islamic jurisprudence, if you have a sound chain of transmission, then this, it's not necessary knowledge, but it is, you have to act upon that. Okay, so as long as we establish sound chain transmission, that's enough for us. So that's the paradox, which unfortunately, I don't know, fortunately or unfortunately, but especially in the past, I would say 200 years, there isn't a single book of introduction to Quranic sciences except that they say, well, the variant readings are transmitted via tawatur. They picked up that word, and there isn't a single textbook of introduction to Quranic sciences in the modern period that they say, well, the variant readings are transmitted through tawatur. However, where's the footnote? We go to the sources and we see that that's not the case, or at least it's not so obvious. And this is why I try to tackle this question and see where this notion of tawatur comes, and can you really prove the tawatur of qira'at at every single stage back to the Prophet. So you could prove tawatur, let's say right now. Of course, all the qira'at are mutawatira now. Everyone knows that they are documented, they are over the internet. But was this the case 500 years ago or 600 years ago? And when we see things change over time, we start asking questions. Well, the way we have the qira'at now are different from the way people were reciting. Not big differences. There are small differences, but they are different nonetheless.
Interesting. So you've given us an excellent summary of the 5 stages. We talked about the importance of the variant readings. We talked a little bit about shawad and tawatur. I'd just like to get a couple of details of each one of these stages, and we'll skip number 2 for now because I want to finish there. Yeah. So let's just start with stage one, the first canonization with Uthman. So I want to give a complete non-specialist perspective. We have Uthman, he's the caliph. He has the authority to make these decisions. Right. His instructions are comprehensive, yet he's very specific down to the dialect.
Yes.
He orders the destruction of non-conforming codices. So it's not immediately clear how variants arise in the first place. So can you explain how these variants first arose?
Well, I mean, again, unfortunately we don't have much documentation from that period to give an answer or an opinion based on facts. But based on these few accounts of why Uthman did this, and actually at every single stage of what I'm calling canonization, the reason why you want to standardize is because you have differences. You don't just come and then you want to standardize something if it's already standardized, right? So what was obvious back then, also from the accounts that we have, is that people or the companions of the Prophet, they were reciting in different ways. And some of these readings survived in the sources, others did not. So what Uthman wanted to do is that, you want to render the text you want to gather all Muslims based on one text. You can't afford to have different versions of the Quran available among the Muslim community. Especially, I mean, the account of the collection, the main account, it's also put the variations of the Quran vis-a-vis the variations in the books of Christians and Jews. That's very obvious. So when Hudayfa ibn al-Yaman comes to Uthman and told him, well, you have to save, the book of the Muslims so that they will not differ in the way that the Jews and Christians differed. Mm-hmm. Okay. So the whole, they were, I don't want to say obsessed, but, this was always something that, Muslims were thinking about, that we need to have a standard version. We can't afford having variations. And that's why, the first, canonization or codification is to try to get rid of variations and gather all Muslims, on one codex, which succeeded in eliminating variations from what we call the codices of the companions. But then you would have the second problem, which is how do you pronounce or how do you render, this text? So that would be the first, it's the reason why I didn't start with that period is that I want to get a sense of what's happening or what happened in the second stage, third stage, fourth stage. And, my plans is to go back to the first stage after I finish all these four, because things repeat themselves in a sense. So if I get a clear idea of how things were standardized, in those periods, probably we can get a clear idea what happened in the first period. Now, again, we can have a seminar on just, the first, the account of Uthman, and there are many problematic issues about, the collection, especially the committee that he put, So besides Zayd bin Thabit, who was, known among the companions to be erudite, knowledgeable about different languages, especially Hebrew and Syriac, the other three members in the committee did not fare as well. So the other three members in the committee, the three of them, they were 9 to 10 years old when the Prophet died. So they were not really senior companions of him. And three of them, they were husbands for three of Uthman's daughters. So again, you see how politics here is, very intertwined with, with the decision of who Uthman chose in the committee to standardize the text. So again, politics is very important. People shouldn't dismiss politics and the decision of the state to standardize a text. This happened with Uthman. This happened with Ibn Mujahid. He was the chief, reader in Baghdad, and people who opposed him, like Ibn Shanabud and Ibn Miqsam, they were tried, tortured, persecuted, according to sources, imprisoned. So that's, that's always something in my mind, that when you look at things were standardized, we always look at how state enforced this kind of standardization on the community, and it takes time. It's not something that you wake up one day and then everyone is reading the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Before we leave stage one, can you give us an idea of how developed the script was that Uthman would have used?
So it's as people know, the Arabic, the Quran was the first book written, right, in Arabic. So this is why it's called the book, or even later Sibawayh's book was called the book. But the Arabic script was not developed. It was derived from Nabatean, as Semitic philologists researched and determined. We didn't have vowels, we didn't have diacritics. Now, was this the reason why we have variant readings? Because we didn't have vowels and diacritics? Not necessarily. Yes, there are certain ambiguous passages in the Quran that you do need vowels and diacritics, and this is why readers disagreed. However, the agreement, the percentage of verses that the readers agreed, even though they were, from different cities, is high. So you don't have someone who's completely reading something that is completely opposite of someone else. So the syntax is basically the same. The disagreement are on those in these cases where you don't know if you should use passive or active. You don't know who the subject is. You don't know how to conjugate, the verb, the prefix. So if you are familiar with the language, I mean, even until today, when I write something very quickly in Arabic, I don't put dots. And we even have manuscripts in Arabic, even 600-700 years after dots and diacritics were developed, where you don't have diacritics. So diacritics and vowels are not the main reason. They are one of the reasons. There are very, very obvious cases where, because you don't have diacritics and vowels, there were variant readings. It's very obvious. It has nothing to do with dialects, has nothing to do with plurality. It has nothing to do with different modes. It has to do with the script. But the majority of variant readings were not because of lack of diacritics and vowels. If you know the language, if this is your language, you can read, if I give you sentences now in English and remove all the E and I and A from them, you would be able to read it with no problem.
Excellent. Thank you. Right around stage one, or the first canonization, many viewers may be aware of the traditions that Omar Hamdan collected about Al-Hajjaj.
Yes.
Do you believe that Al-Hajjaj had any major part to play in this canonization process?
Well, we do have accounts, right? And also Muslim scholars are divided. So, a group would say that Al-Hajjaj did introduce reformation of the script, and other scholars say no, he didn't, right? And I do believe, I'm inclined to say that actually he did include, certain, reformation in the text, because if the early accounts and the early scholars in the Qira'at tradition, they do transmit such accounts, I don't have any reason to doubt them. Okay, so usually, of course, we have contradictory accounts in Islamic tradition. Everything, there isn't a single thing that we don't have contradictory traditions about. But if you have an event, and even if you want to make it up, you make up an event. But if you have different people transmitting something about that event, it means that there's something true to it, right? And all the reformation that Al-Hajjaj did, they were listed, right, by early sources. And some of them say they were 7, they were 8, they were 12, etc. Mm-hmm. The point is, even if it wasn't Al-Hajjaj, let's say it wasn't him, this person specifically, we do know that there were certain reformations in the early manuscripts, because if you see how people were describing certain readings, in the 2nd century, that is 8th century, and how the readers were reading 100 years later or 150 years later, you would see that they were discussing, these kind of specific variations, because there were spelling reforms that changed over time. So whether Al-Hajjaj, the person, did that or not, or whether certain group in the community, they agreed to do this kind of reform. I don't have any reason to dismiss these accounts as completely false, just because I don't want someone to claim that he changed the script, of the codices. Yeah.
Okay. Throughout the 8th century, you've mentioned the influence of the grammarians, and I envision this as being more of an eclectic approach, and I was wondering if that's correct, where they are looking not so much at an entire reading to see if it's acceptable or not, but they're looking more at the microscopic level, at the level of words and sentences. Is that correct?
It is correct. The variant readings of the Quran, it's the domain of grammarians. That's where it is being discussed. Theologians don't deal with variant readings. For theologians, all variant readings are okay. If you want to know why we have this variant, not this variant, what is the justification, grammatical justification of this variant, you go to a grammarian. So this is where all the discipline of variant readings, it evolved from the early grammarians, who were trying to, decipher the text of the Quran based on the proper norms of Arabic, and based on the proper norms of Arabic as that agrees with the corpus of pre-Islamic poetry. So you have the language of pre-Islamic poetry and the language of the Quran. They are very similar, okay, in terms of syntax, vocabulary, etc. So the grammarians, people like Al-Farra, let's say, or Zajjaj, Sibawayh even, their books, the grammar is all filled with Quranic readings. And this is the early source before Ibn Mujahid. And even if someone like Tabari, who's an exegete, he's always quoting grammarians. So grammarians are authority number one when it comes to variant readings. And this is why grammarians clashed with, or not the grammarians didn't clash with anyone. The Muslim scholars later on clashed with grammarians, because grammarians would be criticizing some variant readings. I would say, well, this reading is not grammatical. This reading is not good. And later, Muslim scholars who wanted to say, well, all the readings were correct, you say, oh, you grammarians, we don't listen to you. So if a reading doesn't match, Arabic grammar, you have to make it match Arabic grammar or conform to Arabic grammar, or there's something wrong with your Arabic grammar. God doesn't speak bad Arabic, right?
Okay.
But again, the discipline of variant readings and justifying variant reading, it all mainly resides in grammatical works and exegetical works, which are grammatical in nature.
This grammatical and theological contrast, it seems like, is what got Al-Tabari in trouble, because he's using the razm, he's using grammar, he's using consensus, and he's selecting what he thinks are the good readings. But then later on, when the readings are canonized, it seems like they're read back into pre-Tabari time, and now he looks like he's rejecting readings that are canonical, but it's not his fault. It seems like he kind of got dealt a bad hand with history there.
Well, I mean, exactly, in a sense that, this is why it's important, for us when we are trying to study, a certain phenomena, that we don't apply our own standards today and say, well, this is how Muslims thought about X 500 or 600 years ago. So for Tabari, the whole notion of every single reading transmitted by, Ibn Amr, the Damascene, should be correct, it never existed. For him, he have these readings, and then he would basically judge, is this better than this reading? And the whole argument that I made, if Tabari or even early scholars, they thought that all these readings were divine revelation, you wouldn't be saying, this one is better than this one if both of them are God's word, right? Which is different from how later Muslim scholars dealt with this. So later scholarship on the justification of variant readings, they justified every single variant reading based on some kind of Arabic grammar, because for them, every single reading should be grammatical. And this is why someone like a Tabari or Zamakhshari or even Ibn Atiyah, those exegetes, they were saying, well, wait a second, this reading is really not grammatical. This is bad Arabic. Arabs would never say something like that. And that's why, you know, this kind of criticism for al-Tabari later on is that, oh, you know, he wasn't a reader of the Quran. You know, we don't agree with his criticisms. Okay, fine. You don't agree with the criticisms, but it doesn't, he also doesn't agree with your, you know, also evaluation or criticism. So that's why going back to early sources and reading, you know, these documents, it gives us, you know, a good map of what people thought at different periods of time, and not to apply, you know, certain notions that people believe in now, but they were not existent, you know, centuries before, or they existed in other forms. Yeah.
Excellent. Let's go to stage 3 now. This is the 2 Rawi canon. Of course, you produced a detailed article on this in 2013. I was wondering if you could just give us kind of the broad strokes. You've already mentioned Aldani is one of the major influences here. Could you just describe the scholars who were behind this, why they limited the readers, and also kind of the geographical side of it too, because that's interesting to see. As you said, some of this stuff is geographical as well. So could you kind of summarize stage 3 for us?
Sure. So both Ibn Mujahid, in his book, we do have, as I said, you know, those 7 eponymous readers, and each reader has different transmitters. Okay. Yes, he did rely on transmitters, on certain transmitters more than others, but you would find, you know, one reader, let's say, you know, Kufa, Asim, you know, you would have probably 15 or 16 different transmitters. Okay. I mean, you can imagine how difficult it is for any, you know, student or even scholar to be able to memorize all the different variant readings transmitted by one person if there are even disagreements from that same person. And what happened is that you need manuals, you need textbooks for students. Okay, you can't just teach introduction to variant readings and then give, you know, people 5-volume book on the different variant readings, right? You need a manual. And what happened is that Dani, he was, you know, he died mid-5th Hijri, mid-11th century. He has several books on qira'at, on variant readings, and the biggest of them, it's 4 volumes. It's called Jami' al-Bayan, okay? And he doesn't limit himself to 2 per reader. Like he transmits every single variant reading, which is supposed to be standard, right, for him. He's not saying the standard are only 2. But this is a 4-volume book, very complicated, that you only need to be, you know, not just initiated in the discipline. You really need to be a scholar of qira'at and grammar to be able to understand it. So he wrote this manual called the Taysir, which is, you know, 80, 90 pages in some editions. And he said, I'm going to limit myself, you know, to 2 transmitters per reader so that it would be easier for people to memorize these variants. And of course, people need digests, they need, you know, shorter manuals, and it became very successful, and it started to be taught at different schools. And what made it more popular is that 100 years after Dani, Ash-Shatibi came, and then he versified this manual into a poem. He versified it, and poetry is, you know, it's very important in the Arabic tradition. You memorize things through didactic poems. So he put the whole manual into a poem, and since then it became what we call Shatibiyya, is, you know, how people memorize the variant readings through these texts, Shatibiyya and Dani's Taysir. And what happened is that, you know, this is how you get access to the variant readings, through, you know, these 2 texts and through the 2 transmitters from one person. But in actuality, there are more transmitters, you know, that we do find in these manuals of qira'at. But people started from that period onward, they were only relying on these 2 transmitters. And this is why it is an important phase 3, because now we started to only focus on 2 renditions per reader, rather than see all the different renditions that we received from one eponymous reader. So, and if you go through Dani's Jami' al-Bayan, the 4-volume book, you would not find only Hafs and Shu'ba, Abu Bakr Shu'ba. You would find many different transmitters like Ibn Mujahid. But it's very difficult, you know, for anyone, unless you are an expert in the field, to memorize every single thing. And that's how, you know, this 3rd stage it became important because the tradition from that period onward, they started to rely more on this notion of 2 per reader, mostly in the western part of the Muslim world. In the eastern part, they were still resistant to the whole notion of the 7. And this is when I compared, the manuals of readings from the eastern, parts of the Islamic world, and they were still doing 8 readings, 9 readings, 6 readings, and they were, relying on different transmitters. But what happened is that this book, Shatibiya, the poem, it became popular. People, even in the East, started to memorize it, and it started to be taught in schools. And this is where, people were now familiar with Hafs, Asim, Shu'ba, Asim, Warsh, Nafi', and then all the other transmitters started to be forgotten over time, except for the elite, educated readers whose profession is, just doing, qira'at or readings of the Quran. Yeah.
So is it correct to say that this was never, let's say, legislated, like Ibn Mujahid's standardization? It became popular and became dominant. Is that correct?
It wasn't. The thing is, both Dani and the Shatibi, they did enjoy patronage from, from the courts. So Shatibi was, recruited to Egypt, and he was given a house, and then he was given, funding, money, just like teach. And Dani was also recruited to one of the courts in Dania. And he, wrote these books. So both of them, they were, the highest, let's say, authority in qira'at. What made Shatibi's canonization popular is his poem at the end. So if it were not for the poem and for Dani's Taysir, we wouldn't have, this kind of 2 rawis per system, unless someone else would have written, another manual, limiting it to 2. And since Shatibi, after Shatibi, this tradition of writing didactic poems on qira'at, it became very popular. And that's why also Ibn al-Jazari, the addition of his 3 readings also became popular, because he also wrote a poem on that. So people also now memorize the poem on the 3 additional readings, because it's easier to memorize. So they memorize, Shatibiya, the 7 readings plus the 3. If you are doing it, with the, the 10 standard readings. And because he wrote this poem and people memorized it, it also became easier to memorize. So despite the fact that before him there were many attempts to write, not canonize, but to write manuals on 10 readings, 9 readings, 8 readings, but he was politically influential, and his didactic poem, and he was an authority in the field, and he wrote a didactic poem emulating Shatibi, 300, 400 years before him.
Excellent. So this process of the 2 rawi canons started in the West, it spread to the East. Is it safe to say that it became stable by the 11th or 12th century or something?
Oh, yeah. It became stable by the, right after Shatibi. It just became popular even, during his time, his lifetime. And Shatibi was, described in even in the sources, due to his success, and he would see dreams, he would see the prophet, he was, almost elevated to, a saintly rank, in the way that he was described in the sources. So definitely by the 12th century, this system in schools where people, were memorizing. Even until today, people, if you want to memorize, if you want to get certified in varied readings, you do it through Shatibiya, you do it through Shatibi's poem and through Jazari's poem. But yes, so possibly 11th, 12th century, we would say 12th century, we start to see in bibliographical information, indices, that people have commentaries on this poem, and there are many copies in different libraries where people are interested in copying it, memorizing it, and studying it.
Excellent. So let's stop by Ibn al-Jazari before we go back to stage 2. You described he wrote a poem on his 3 additional readings. For many of us, it seems far too late for him to canonize 3 additional readings. Does his ability to canonize 3 additional readings, does that reflect a continued sense of dislike by Muslim scholars in having 7 qira'at, which of course could have corresponded to the 7 ahruf. Were Muslim scholars just wanting to get rid of the 7 in effect?
Definitely, because even after Ibn Mujahid, there was a lot of discussion and criticisms against Ibn Mujahid. Why did you choose 7? Why did you create, what we call this shubha, this, creating this doubt in Muslims that the 7 ahruf that, the Prophet mentioned in his hadith are the 7 readings. So that's one reason. We don't want people to think that the readings are the ahruf, because as I said multiple times, no one knows what the ahruf is. And if someone tells you that he or she knows what the ahruf is, well, no one knows. So we take the word of Muslim scholars who spent years and years and years trying to understand what the ahruf are, and no one knows. There are speculations, but at the end of the day, they're only speculations. So one, we don't want to match the 7 readings with the 7 ahruf. Second, still there was a lot of resistance to limiting qira'at. Muslim scholars, especially exegetes, you don't want to limit yourself to a canon. And if we go to books of commentaries, Quranic commentaries, commentators are always going far and beyond to try to understand a certain verse or give a commentary on a certain verse, and they would use every single variant reading possible or available to them in order to give you a different aspect or a different interpretation of the verse. So people dislike the fact that you are limiting them to a canon. They want flexibility. So scholars of qira'at were always criticizing the community. Why are you limiting us to 7? Why are you limiting us to 2 per 1, i.e. 14 transmissions? And it's very obvious in many statements by Muslim scholars. Why are people only thinking that the Quran is only Shatibiyya? Why people are thinking the Quran is only Taysir? We have more readings, we have more variations. We should cherish that and not limit it. Okay, so Ibn al-Jazari comes from that perspective, and then he said, well, people should stop thinking that the 7 readings are the only Quran or the only qira'at, to decipher the Quran or to read it. And then he added those 3 readings, which were already, he was not the first time to transmit those readings. They have been, in circulation since, the 10th century. But what he did is that he was able to really, create this kind of system where the 10 readings with his poem, and he was able to, as I said several times, he was able to talk with the jurists during his time, convince them to declare the 10 readings, not only the 7, the 10 readings, to be mutawatira, as divine revelation. And he was successful. And after him, again, in the Islamic world, in different schools, they memorize Shatibi's poem and Ibn al-Jazari's poem, when they want to get certified, in the variant readings.
Excellent. So this takes us to our final stage, which I think is probably the most interesting, and that's Ibn Mujahid. And what I want to do here is just leave the question very open-ended. He's a giant in this period of history. He obviously made some very important decisions and had the authority to do so. So could you just tell us about him? And then wherever you want to go with this, if you could give us a foreshadowing of your book that's coming out next month. And as you do that, I will keep an eye on the comments. Shady has agreed to answer some questions. So any questions that come up that are related to this topic as he's telling us about Ibn Mujahid, I'll put those up on the screen.
Sure. So the topic of my forthcoming book, it's Ibn Mujahid and the founding of the 7 readings. So it's continuation of the first monograph, and of course why he's important, because he's the first one, or at least this is the first manual we receive, which became the prototype, let's say, of all manuals of variant readings afterwards. And the way that he starts with the principles of recitation, and then he discusses the individual variant readings in the Quran. Why he's again important, because before him we only have bibliographical information about manuals of readings, but we didn't receive them. So this is why his book is very important. Why I'm, of course, interested in this, because, as I said, I'm studying all these different stages. I want to see what did Muslims, in the 9th century recite. Were they reciting, the same readings that we are reciting today? Were there readings back then that people were reciting, and then we stopped reciting them now? That's the very important question here for me. What the rise of shawad or irregular readings, and I argued, and I'm now more convinced after I did a thorough study of his book, that the concept of shawad, it's not only deviating from the Uthmanic Codex, but it's violating the consensus. As long as there's some kind of consensus, whether it's local consensus or general consensus, then your reading will be relegated into this shawad realm. So we find many readings in Ibn Mujahid that people stopped reciting today, and even stopped reciting 300 years after him. He also disagrees, I think 7 or 8 times with the canonical readings themselves. With some readings, let's say from Ibn Amir or Hamza, he would say this is wrong, something that you don't find later on. He also has a lot of, I think I counted 64 transmission errors in his book, where he said that this transmission is wrong, this is wrong, it should be this way, it should be that way. So he is, he was more critical in the way that he was compiling his book, different from how later authors of qira'at, where they were just documenting, they were receiving and then writing down without really trying to sift, let's say, through the material. So that's why he's important, and he is one of the important, what we call tariq or path to the Meccan reading. So without Ibn Mujahid, you don't have access to the Meccan reading, let's say. So Meccan reading, Ibn Kathir, he has 2 students, Qumbul and Al-Bazzi. So through Qumbul, he has also 2 paths, Ibn Mujahid and his colleague Ibn Shanabur. Both of them, they were the channels through which we know the reading, the Meccan reading. So he's also important, as part of this, living chain of transmission. So that's the, topic of the book. I studied, all the variant readings in his book are documented. There will be a complete, chart at the end of the book with audio material. So, and everything is transliterated. So people who don't read Arabic can read the transliteration and can also hear the audio with the specific, so you don't have to hear the whole verse, you just listen to the word. I did that, all myself in the past 4 years. So hopefully we will see how it goes. Hopefully next month it should be out. Yeah.
Yes, excellent. So a couple of questions. One is kind of a question related to modern Muslim scholarship. Is there, and it's kind of related to the question, is there a consensus on the number of readings today? If you took a survey across Muslim scholars, would they all say 10? Would there be a variant?
You have 3 groups. You have one group that will tell you 7. They have the other group that would tell you 10, and you have a smaller group that would tell you 14. We do have, actually, now there's Sheikh Hassan Sakandari. If people want to look him up, he's an Egyptian reader, official, not just an amateur, and he is certified, and he teaches 14 readings, not just 10. So there are people who think 7, 10, and 14. So the system of the 14 has been around for the past 200, 300 years. People were trying to add 4 readings. I don't want to say the majority of Muslim scholars would say those 4 are considered irregular, but let's say a majority, so less than the majority. A majority would say it's only 10. Another majority would say 7, and we do have a sizable group that they would still use the 14 today in recitation.
Excellent. This is a good question. Some colleagues, Van Putten and Al-Jalad, what do you think in general of their work, and how does that interface with your area of expertise?
I mean, Semitic philology and and codicology is, the other face, let's say, of our work. So mostly my work is concerned with Arabic dialects, post standardization in a sense. I don't use codicology, or I use manuscripts for books, or when I want to look something up, but I'm not a codicologist. So this is where Jallad, as a Semitic philologist, he and Van Putten also, he works with Semitic philology and codicology. They study the status of Arabic vis-a-vis other dialects. He can tell you what kind of dialect was popular in the Hijaz. We have this whole notion of the old Hijazi dialect, which probably the Prophet was speaking. So this is very important in terms of how Arabic, or what we call Al-Arabiya, these standards Arabic, how it evolved. And this line of Semitic philology is very important for us to see what was happening, and then does it agree or disagree with the literature of Qira'at and different dialects, and to what extent dialects influenced, let's say, the development of the discipline of variant readings.
And Dr. Al-Jalad is producing a lot of data, isn't he? It must be difficult to keep up with.
It is difficult, of course, but I mean, that's what the Semitic philologists, they work with inscriptions, they work with all these different languages, and it's very vital for us to to consult this material, and especially when it comes to what we call the rasm. Why do we have certain words in the Quran written with waw? It comes from Nabatean / Aramaic. So it's important to know why certain words were written as such, how certain words are pronounced. So definitely, yeah.
Excellent. Well, we'll end with 2 more questions, and these are easy. I can answer them. Can someone please put the link to his book? And so, yes, I will. As soon as this live stream is over, I'll add that. But I also want to say, in the description box, there are a number of links. So you can go to watch Dr. Nasser's lecture on Vimeo. There's also a lecture on YouTube. And there's also a link there to the Bottled Petrichor podcast that Shady appeared on some time ago. And then the next question is, what is Shady Nasser's latest book? And that is the second canonization of the Quran, Ibn Mujahid, and the founding of the 7 readings. And that's coming out next month. And I will add those links to the description box. Thank you, everyone, for watching. Dr. Nasser, it's been a very quick hour. It's been a thrill to talk to you, though. I've enjoyed it so much. Thank you for spending part of your Saturday with us.
No, thank you for having me, and I'm very glad we had this discussion. So hopefully it was informative and and helpful, and it was a pleasure to be here. So yeah.
Thank you.
Bye bye.